Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Suggett, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals, or CARSP. And welcome to today's webinar entitled Understanding Mandatory Alcohol Screening. And I have two amazing presenters with us today, and I will be presenting them in a minute. But first, I just wanted to share that CARSP provides these monthly webinars free to our members. And actually, we've just started a non-member fee to be able to participate in the webinar. So if you're not a CARSP member, you can pay a one-time $50 fee per webinar to participate. But joining is very affordable. It's only $125 per year. And there are group rates available as well if you have others in your workplace who'd like to join. So once again, we do monthly webinars. They're on all different types of topics. And later on, we have a post-conference survey or webinar survey where you're able to provide topics. So if you have one that you'd like to see presented here, please provide that information. So first, before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to give you some housekeeping instructions. First of all, questions. We do entertain them, but we do that after the presentations. And we ask you to submit your questions in the Q&A area in the middle at the bottom of your screen. And once again, those will be answered after the presentations. And as I alluded to earlier, we do have a post-webinar survey. This will pop up automatically as you exit the webinar. And we ask that you just take a couple minutes. It just gives us some feedback that we can then provide to the presenters. It also helps us with ideas, as I mentioned before, of possible topics that you can provide us for future webinars. And also, as an added incentive to encourage you to complete the survey, we have a draw for a $25 Tim's gift card. So if you want that opportunity, get out there and fill out that form. That'd be great. So now I'm going to introduce our two speakers today. And we have Doug Burness, who is actually one of our board members as well, and very excited to have him here, as well as Joanna Wells from Justice Canada. So first of all, Joanna Wells works as Senior Legal Counsel in the Criminal Law and Policy section of Justice Canada and has had carriage of the impaired driving file for over 10 years, during which time she has supported the government in an enactment and implementation of reforms to the impaired driving regime in the criminal code. Dr. Burnett has dedicated his career to research on alcohol and drug-impaired driving. He has an MASc in addiction studies and a PhD in psychology. Working as a senior research associate and an independent researcher, he has contributed extensively to the field through publications and presentations worldwide. Recognized for his expertise, Doug has served on significant committees, received accolades like the DRE Ambassador and the Haddon Award, and has been honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from CARSP. And without further ado, I will pass it over to our first presenter, who is Joanna Wells. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Brenda. I turned my camera on too early. I didn't realize how extensive Doug's very impressive biography was going to be. So thank you for inviting me to present here on mandatory alcohol screening. And thank you to everybody who's joining, who is interested in this topic. So I've prepared a very short slide presentation that touches sort of on the main background elements of mandatory alcohol screening, kind of a who, what, why kind of presentation, but I certainly will appreciate at the end some more probing questions that you may have that might provide you with some more detail. So if we could move to the first slide, the overview. You're all here, you likely know what mandatory alcohol screening is, but in the interest of being thorough, I thought I would just take a moment to situate it in the context. So the term mandatory alcohol screening itself is a Canadian creation. The actual action or power that it represents was developed long before Canada put it into law, and you'll probably recognize it more as being called random breath testing. It's the same thing, but we Canadianized it, or the government Canadianized it in the legislation to reflect more how we felt that it was going to be used in the Canadian impaired driving investigatory context. You'll know that it's used very commonly, and Doug will provide a lot more detail about this internationally. I believe it was pioneered by Australia, but was then adopted by Ireland, New Zealand. I think more than 50% of the EU countries also have some similar form. And Canada adopted the power in 2018. Next slide, please. And so that 2018 was kind of a spoiler alert for my next slide. Mandatory alcohol screening, the when did this come in? So it came in 2018, as I said, through former Bill C-46, an act to amend the criminal code, offenses relating to conveyances, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. And if I had a quarter for every time I had to write that long title out in a document, I would be retired somewhere on a beach. For those of you who pay attention to these sorts of things, you'll know that Bill C-46 was a significant legislative package of reforms in the impaired driving space. In addition to sort of its overarching objective of saving lives and improving road safety, the legislative package had two main objectives of strengthening the drug impaired driving regime in advance of cannabis legalization. So when the government announced it was intending to legalize cannabis, there was a significant interest in how we would protect drivers on the roads. So that was one aspect of it. And the other overarching objective was to modernize, simplify, and strengthen the impaired driving regime. And that those pieces resulted in a very significant reform. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I did just want to point out, in addition to mandatory alcohol screening, and in my view, I think mandatory alcohol screening was probably one of the most significant changes made through C-46 in terms of police powers. But C-46 also enacted new blood drug concentration offenses, per se offenses in the drug context, and allowed the police to use roadside screening tools, oral fluid screeners in particular, to better screen for drug impaired driving. And the other two elements relate to sort of facilitating the investigation and prosecution of alcohol impaired driving by removing very counter public safety defenses, I think, that were available to accused drivers at the time, and also that served to undermine the breath testing process and made it just a lot easier to prove what someone's blood alcohol concentration was. So mandatory alcohol screening happened sort of in the context of all of these significant changes to the impaired driving regime. So the next slide, please, is the what. And so this is, I put this in a diagram form. I wanted to sort of bring your attention to the actual, like, what mandatory alcohol screening looks like in practice. So if you could click for the first, so you'll see here sort of the focus is what the roadside screening procedure looked like before mandatory alcohol screening was enacted. It was essentially a two-step process. You'll see the circle covering both of those steps. So the police had conducted their traffic stop. And then when they went up to the window of the driver, they turned their mind as to whether or not they had a reasonable suspicion of whether or not that driver had alcohol in their body, had they been drinking. And so they would ask them some questions, they would sniff around, they would look at their eyes. So they would take steps to develop that reasonable suspicion. And then if they had that reasonable suspicion, they would be able to lawfully demand a breath sample on an approved screening device. You could click for me. So when MASS was enacted, and then click again, you can see that those two steps were essentially collapsed into one step. It's a lot more streamlined through this process. So now, following that same traffic stop, the police don't need to ask questions. They don't need to examine your eyes. They don't need to look for or listen for signs of slurred speech. they can simply make the demand. The reasonable suspicion standard has been removed. I think one thing to remember here, and this was an important distinction that we always try to make, and sometimes more successfully than others in some of our communications materials in particular, is that mandatory alcohol screening is not a new stopping power. It doesn't provide the police with new powers to pull drivers over. They have those powers. They have been upheld as constitutional, and they've been used fairly regularly since 1985. They exist both, that stopping power already exists both in common law and under provincial highway traffic acts. So mandatory alcohol screening builds on that existing stopping power, but is really an investigative step used to detect alcohol in drivers. Next slide, please. So the next slide is the why. Mandatory alcohol screening, the why. Why did the government go down this road? What was the impetus behind mandatory alcohol screening as part of this legislative package? So as a sort of a general overview, there was at the time an increasing stakeholder pressure to consider this policy change, which resulted from either culminated in, or maybe you could say resulted in, a 2009 study by the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. So they conducted an overall study of impaired driving in Canada and released a report called, I think it was called Ending Impaired Driving, A Common Approach. And in that report, the committee unanimously recommended that Parliament adopt mandatory alcohol screening as an investigative tool to better detect and prevent impaired driving. They made a number of other recommendations as well, which were incorporated, but mandatory alcohol screening sort of was a cornerstone of that report. So that was sort of the, I think, a kickstart, which gave the government some something to sort of hang their hats on, that this had been studied. It was all party support. And the committee in their report recommended, there's a number of policy justifications for why, and the government, when they introduced mandatory alcohol screening, relied on these policy justifications for why mandatory alcohol screening was necessary. And I believe the Minister of Justice in her remarks indicated she felt obligated, given some of the science and the data around alcohol detection, that she felt obligated to enact mandatory alcohol screening. So one of those reasons, and one of the more compelling, is the international success in other countries in using mandatory alcohol screening. I know Doug will get more into this in terms of the data from those countries, but in terms of lives saved and accidents reduced, there was a lot of great supporting data that mandatory alcohol screening, or random breath testing as they studied it, really had a positive impact on road safety. The government also relied on the fact, or on the evidence that existed at the time, that generally suspicion-based breath testing is not a very efficient way of detecting impaired drivers. Police might be very confident in their capacity to figure out who is and who isn't drinking, but the objective evidence indicated that they're maybe not as good as they think they are. So there were a number of studies that were relied on that indicated that police might fail to detect at least half, and some suggested even higher, of the number of drivers who were over the legal limit based on a suspicion-based framework. So that was fairly compelling. And so that was the historical evidence. And I think that has borne out in practice, and police will tell you that where mandatory alcohol screening has been rolled out in a very whole scale approach, they are finding drivers that they never in a million years under a suspicion-based program would have tested with significant blood alcohol concentration levels. So the evidence supported it, and we're seeing it in real life. And finally, there's an element of deterrence that was used to support the enactment. I think experienced drinking drivers in particular will know that the chances of them being caught are very low. But with mandatory alcohol screening, those chances increase. And with those increasing chances, not only do you catch more drinking drivers and get them off the road, but you may also change people's behavior to prevent them from getting behind the wheel or drinking less, or just mitigate in some cases the risk. So those were the whys that the government relied on when they enacted it in 2018. So we'll go to the next slide. The how. How is mandatory alcohol screening conducted? So this just duplicates the graphic that was in the what it is, and I put it in there just sort of to bring our minds back to how mandatory alcohol screening operates it on the ground. And I wanted to point out some operational limitations in the legislation on the use of mandatory alcohol screening at the roadside. So the policy intent was to put fairly strict parameters around its use to counteract the potential criticisms that were anticipated when it was introduced. So first off, the officer must be conducting a lawful traffic stop. While this is generally the case in all interactions between police and the public, the mandatory alcohol screening provision in the code spells it out in the actual provision, which is unique. Mandatory alcohol screening, as well as the name suggests, only applies to alcohol and not to drugs. And so the suspicion-based power is still in the law, and it applies, so the suspicion-based power applies when these operational requirements can't be met or in cases of drugs. So that was intended, A, to limit the application of mandatory alcohol screening, but it also supports an investigation of a drug-impaired driving case for other reasons that I won't get into because I don't think I have the time. Mandatory alcohol screening only applies to motor vehicles. So you may know that the impaired driving laws apply to planes and trains and boats and cars, but mandatory alcohol screening only applies to cars. And that's because the bulk of our evidence was on the roads and applied to motor vehicles on the road. And so we had the evidence to support that, but also because mandatory alcohol screening relies on the police stopping power, their ability to stop vehicles, and that power doesn't necessarily exist in the same way for trains and planes. It seemed to make operational sense to just limit it to cars. Mandatory alcohol screening requires that the ASD be with the officer making the demand. So I think the term in the code is on hand, and it just means close by. This operational limitation had a lot more meaning when MAST was enacted in 2018 than it probably does now, given some developments made by the Supreme Court, which sort of applies this reasoning now to other areas. So it doesn't impact how mandatory alcohol screening is used, but the ASD generally now must be on hand in all situations, including suspicion-based breath testing. You can't call the police station anymore to get the ASD brought to you. You must have it. In the mandatory alcohol screening context, that was meant to make sure that the interactions were short and it wasn't a huge delay or imposition on a person's time or privacy, but so that was the justification for mandatory alcohol screening. And finally, mandatory alcohol screening only applies if the driver is operating the vehicle. So it doesn't apply in situations, for example, where you get a 911 call and someone says this driver is operating erratically, and the police then find that driver at home, cars in the driveway and the driver's at home. They can't make a mandatory alcohol screening demand at that time. The officer is not, the driver is not operating. It really is intended to be like a roadside stop, a roadside check, move people through quickly to keep drivers safe. It's not meant to necessarily expand all of the investigative tools that police have at their disposal. So those are the operational limitations, the how for mandatory alcohol screening. The next slide, please. So this is the where, and I did this sort of where we are now. Where are we with mandatory alcohol screening? So as the government expected, there was a significant volume of legal challenges to Bill C-46 in its entirety, but the most of them were to mandatory alcohol screening. So this slide provides a list of all the cases that I'm aware of across the country where mandatory alcohol screening was upheld as a constitutional power. There are 4 Superior Court decisions, and they're in bold, at the bottom, and the Superior Court just means it's slightly more authoritative. It applies across the entire province. And so those ones sort of have a bit more weight or a few more teeth than maybe some of the other ones. The two at the bottom, Wright and Westgard, are from Saskatchewan. They're currently, I think, leave is being sought to appeal to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. So they may be the first cases where we get an appeal level judgment. But to date, the courts have been very supportive of the government's arguments towards supporting mandatory alcohol screening. And I'm not aware of a case where, so these are the ones where we know it was upheld. I'm not aware of one where it wasn't upheld based on the evidence that we provided. So that's where we are with mandatory alcohol screening. It's a fairly positive development. The next slide is where I'm going to leave it and turn it over to Doug. It's just it's a continuation of the where slide, the where we are, because you'll recall that I mentioned throughout the presentation that mandatory alcohol screening is not a stopping power. That stopping power exists in common law and under the Highway Traffic Act, and mandatory alcohol screening builds on that. That stopping power was held to be constitutional by the Supreme Court in 1985 in a case called La Douceur. In 2020, I believe, it was challenged again. That random stopping power is being challenged. There's a case in Quebec called Luamba, who sued the province of Quebec as well as the federal government for allowing police to operate under the common law power, under that random common law stopping power and the highway traffic power. And he is alleging that it's different now because we have more, better, and stronger evidence of racial profiling. And it's the racial profiling element of that random stopping power that renders that unconstitutional. So that is a developing area in this space. The Superior Court of Quebec struck down the stopping power, and the Attorney General of Quebec appealed to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal heard that decision earlier this month. And so within the next year, we will have a Court of Appeal decision, which will then determine the next steps. It's quite possible that this case will end up at the Supreme Court as well on that question. And so it's not directly related to mandatory alcohol screening, but because mandatory alcohol screening relies on that power, I wanted to just bring it to your attention and raise it as part of sort of the landscape, the fabric of what is at issue. And so my final slide, I'm not going to speak to it. I just want to put it in there for people's information. If there's one more slide, if you could just click for it. Thank you. This is just a reference to the 3-year review that we did of C46. It was legislative required that the Minister of Justice do a report within 3 years. If you Google the title, you can see the image of the report there. And you want to do more reading, it will provide you with an overview. I expect that Doug will touch on a bit of that because he's featured very heavily in some of the data in that report because he provided a lot of it to us. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention in case you're interested. So I'll stop there on my overview of mandatory alcohol screening, turn it over to Doug, and then look forward to your questions at the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. And while Doug's getting set up, I just wanted to once again remind people that they can submit their questions at the bottom of the screen using the Q&A function. So keep them coming in. You can provide those at any point, but they will be answered after Doug's presentation. And the other thing I wanted to share, just once again, remind you about the survey that's going to pop up automatically after you're finished. And there's a $25 gift card that's up for grabs. So I encourage you to do that. Thanks. Thanks, Doug. Go for it. Oh, I think you need to swap screens, Doug, because it's showing the, you see at the very top where it says display settings. And I think you might be muted too, possibly.
Am I muted now?
No, you're not. But you see at the top on the left, it says display settings there. If you click on that,
No, it doesn't say that.
oh, it doesn't for you. Okay.
It says I'm screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Well, you're just on the different screen than you're on the one that with the notes. And we see a couple of pop-ups for you.
Oh,
It's okay. Why don't we just proceed? Because we can still see it, you know. So yeah, just go right ahead.
okay. So I'm sort of going to pick up where Joanna left off here. And of course, now I can't change my slides. There. We see that one?
Yeah, it's now
Okay.
appearing.
All right. So we're on our way here. So Joanne mentioned that about why we're doing mandatory alcohol screening. And it really breaks down into two pieces. One is to help keep the roadway safe by removing from the road drivers who have consumed too much alcohol and are causing a risk not only to themselves, but to other drivers. Secondly, it's to serve as a high profile deterrent for other drivers. I'll get into that in a few minutes. So we talked a little bit about alcohol detection, and prior to mandatory alcohol screening, we really needed to establish suspicion. The officer had to have some idea that the driver had been drinking, or as those in the legal profession are apt to jump all over me for saying, it's not had been drinking, it's had alcohol in their body, to which the rebellious adolescent in me wants to ask, how do you think they got it in there? Which never goes over really well. There are other ways to get alcohol in your body, but I'll leave it to you to look up the YouTube videos of that. It's disgusting, but it can be done. But they have to establish that the driver had they have some suspicion that the driver had consumed alcohol. They can look at driving behavior. They can follow them down the road and they're weaving, whatever's going on with them. There's a reason for them to stop the driver. Physical signs, eyes, speech, coordination, all those things that are typically done and well known to most people who work in this field. And the ubiquitous odor of alcohol beverages. Olfactory detection. I like to talk about using the sense of smell to detect alcohol. First of all, we have to recognize that the smell of alcohol is inherently unreliable. Pure alcohol really has no odor. What you're smelling are the congeners and other flavorings and additives to the beverage, and you're picking up on that, and it's depending on the extent to which you've consumed alcohol and what you've been drinking, what those congeners and other flavorings are that are in that beverage. So smell is not really good, and I'll give you some evidence of that in a minute here. But it's referred to as a high sensitivity, low specificity clue, and that's really just a fancy way of saying if you smell alcohol or if you think you smell alcohol, you're probably right. You've got a person who has a relatively high level of alcohol in their system, and you're smelling it. You're right, but it's got low specificity, which means that if you don't smell alcohol, you know nothing at all. It's not a clue. There are 4 studies that have looked at this over the years, and they're all done by scholars in the area of alcohol. I'm not going to go into the details of all of these. Widmark, way back in 1932, did a study where he was looking at the use of the smell of alcohol, and he had physicians evaluate subjects who had consumed alcohol, and they had to determine whether or not the person had been drinking, and they failed miserably at it. They missed a lot of drivers who were over 100. 100 milligrams per deciliter. It wasn't until drivers were over a BAC of 260 were they able to detect all those people simply by smell. Richard Compton from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration did an interesting study where what he did was they set up a checkpoint from downstream from a closed course driving situation. They had drivers consume a bunch of alcohol or a placebo and go down, and at the end of the experimental drive, there was a police checkpoint set up, and the officer had to determine whether or not the driver had consumed alcohol and what their alcohol level was. Again, they failed miserably. They detected less than half of the drivers who were over 80. And the final study that I just want to mention quickly was a novel one done by Herb Moskowitz from the University of California. He had people drink some alcohol and had a bunch of police officers on the other side of an opaque curtain with straws through it. And every now and then a person would have to step up to this opaque curtain and blow through a straw, and the officer had to determine whether they'd been drinking and how much they'd been drinking, what their possible BAC was. They too didn't do so well. So the odor of alcohol is not really the best clue to be using when you're trying to detect drinking drivers. The final study I want to mention is done by Joanne Wells, not Joanna Wells, who was here with us today, but Joanne Wells from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. This was done as part of an evaluation of the introduction of the .08 law in North Carolina. We were doing roadside surveys. So we were collecting voluntary breath samples downstream from police checkpoints all across North Carolina. And we did this both before and after the introduction of the new law. So it really was an evaluation study. The state police in North Carolina insisted that they have the opportunity to check drivers before they got to the survey. Made it very, very complicated to do that. But what we were able to do was get the blood alcohol concentrations from the drivers that they did stop and wanted to check more thoroughly. But then we did our regular sampling downstream, and we were able to determine that the officers failed to detect 62% of drivers with a BAC over 80 and 87% who had a BAC over 50. It's very difficult to do. Is there a better way? Well, the standardized field sobriety test is a good one. It was developed specifically to detect alcohol impairment in drivers and be done at the side of the road. It requires suspicion that the driver has alcohol in their body before you can do that. It's validated, it works really well, but you have to be trained. And again, you have to have that suspicion. Passive alcohol sensors. Passive alcohol sensors are really kind of a cool instrument, because whereas an ASD, an approved screening device, requires you to blow into it, a passive alcohol sensor does not require that. It simply collects a small sample of ambient air in the vicinity of the driver's face and determines whether or not there's alcohol present in that sample. They work very well. We use them in a variety of projects, both in the field and in the lab, and they work fine. They have one problem. And this, by the way, was long before COVID came along. Hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer contains alcohol. You stop a driver who's recently used hand sanitizer, which, by the way, was used long before COVID, mostly in hospitals, and you'll get a positive response on a passive alcohol sensor if a person has been using hand sanitizer. So they are very limited. There were several U.S. court cases dealing with the use of passive alcohol sensors, and I won't go into them, but basically they're saying that once a driver exhales, once a person exhales, the breath no longer belongs to them. So it was fair game that the police officer could test it. And secondly, they ruled that a passive alcohol sensor was merely an extension of the officer's nose. We have approved screening devices for getting an accurate indication of the extent of alcohol. Again, up until mandatory alcohol screening, you had to have suspicion. Now we have mandatory alcohol screening where we can use the ASD without suspicion. So as Joanna mentioned earlier, many countries around the world use some form of mandatory alcohol screening. The Australians are the ones who coined the term random breath testing. I don't like that term. There's nothing random about it. They test everybody. It's certainly not random. I had the opportunity many years ago to go down and watch mandatory or random breath testing in operation. They have booze buses where they actually have it set up so they can do evidential testing on the scene as well. So they're not just taking ASDs and screening drivers, they can test them with an evidential device at roadside. They've used it extensively. Their goal in many of the Australian states is to do one test for every driver in the population each year. That's huge. That's massive testing for alcohol. It's extensive and they're committed to it. The primary objectives are to identify offenders and general deterrence. When you do a lot of it, you're getting that general deterrence effect. And that what you're really doing is preventing a behavior through the enhanced perception as well as an enhanced probability of being caught and punished. And if you can think about a very simple example, if your brother or sister, when you were younger, was caught stealing a cookie out of the cookie jar and was punished, that has a deterrent effect on your behavior. You are less likely to try to steal a cookie because you're afraid of being caught and punished. More importantly, if your mother's standing there and you know that you will be caught if you take that cookie, there's a deterrent effect of that. And that deterrent, the general deterrent effect, is much stronger in that situation than it is in the other. So what we're doing with mandatory alcohol screening is to enhance general deterrence by having this presence of people, police officers out on the road testing drivers for alcohol all the time, regardless of whether they think they've consumed alcohol or not. And in a way, general deterrence is to impaired driving as prevention is to public health. And if you can think back to, not so long ago when COVID hit, there were so many sick people, we could not treat all the sick people adequately. Our hospitals were overrun. We were dealing with tertiary prevention, really, and that is trying to cure the sick people. Once we got into the node of prevention with hand sanitizer and masking and, well, even lockdowns, if you like, and vaccines, we're in the mode of prevention. Preventing the number of cases that came to our attention was much more effective than trying to treat the sick people. In the same way, trying to prevent people from driving after drinking while impaired is much more effective than trying to catch all the impaired drivers on the road. If you look at the amount of drivers that we have in this country, I think it's close to 30 million now, and they drive approximately 400 billion kilometers in a year. That's a lot of driving. If you look at the amount of alcohol consumption, I wrote the figures down earlier, it's staggering. If you look at the amount of alcohol that's sold, it comes to something like 9.2 drinks per person of legal drinking age per week. That's a lot of alcohol. The opportunity for drinking and driving to interact is tremendous. The police can't keep up with it by simply trying to arrest all those drivers who have had too much alcohol to drive safely. Deterrence is much more effective. If you look up general deterrence in a dictionary or online, you're liable to see something that says prevent crime by instilling fear in the public through punishment of offenders. That's part of it. It's only part of it. It's not the whole thing. Sure, there's a general deterrent effect by seeing people being punished for various crimes. It's true for impaired driving as well. Even if we just read about it in the paper, you're hearing the sentences that people are getting for impaired driving. It's not enough. What we need to do is create an environment where there is the perception and a high probability of being caught. That creates greater general deterrence. One of the reasons that we think this is the case is that in roadside surveys where we ask drivers a variety of questions, we have thousands of responses to this question over the years. We ask drivers, why do you think people persist in driving after drinking? The two most common responses that we get are, they don't think they're impaired. They're fooling themselves, but they don't think they're impaired. They don't really know, but they don't think they are. And secondly, they don't think they're going to get caught. What's stopping them? They're going to get away with it. They've probably gotten away with it many times before. Unfortunately, there's a lot who don't make it home. So, does it work? Well, there's been a lot of research done in Australia, and Ireland's looked at theirs too. There's other places that have looked at the impact of random breath testing. Some of those studies are pretty intense, and they've controlled for everything they could possibly think of, and they find a profound effect of mandatory alcohol screening. We don't have that kind of evidence in Canada just yet, but we have a couple of things that we can look at. A few years ago, we were able to collect some data from the police in Edmonton. I know this is a big, complicated looking chart with a lot of numbers on it, and I'm just going to step you through a little bit of it. In Edmonton, the Edmonton police collected statistics on all their road check operations, their checkpoints that they were doing. They kept track of the number of operations, the total vehicles, the number of approved screening devices they did, number of thefts they did, number of arrests, and all that kind of stuff. And they started this in 2014. So they have data from 2014 through 2019, and they provided it to us so we could have a look at it. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out. I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but the first yellow column there, the one that's labeled ASD per vehicle, prior to mass, 11.6% of drivers who went through a checkpoint were breath tested. After mandatory alcohol screening, 99.2% were breath tested. That's a huge difference. Why isn't it 100? We should have 100, right? Well, there are occasions when you just can't do it. For example, if you don't have a mouthpiece with you, that happens. You run out of mouthpieces. You don't realize you're going to do so many breath tests in a night. You might run out of mouthpieces, so you can't do a test. Happens very rarely. The number of impaired driving arrests are, and the number of immediate roadside suspensions, the number of graduated driver licensing suspensions are there as well. I lump those all together into total enforcement actions related to alcohol use, and summarize them in the second yellow column, where you see that prior to mass, 3.2% of the vehicles stopped had some form of enforcement action applied. After mandatory alcohol screening came into effect, 4.41%. That doesn't sound like a big difference, but it is. If you look at it in terms of enforcement actions per check stop operations, we went from 7.78 to 13.3%. Now, interestingly enough, the one thing they also kept track of was the number of suspended licenses they found and arrested the drivers for driving with a suspended license. And the percentage of vehicles in which that occurred was 0.26% prior to MAS and 0.29 after. So it didn't go up. There's no reason to believe that it should go up after mandatory screening came into play. This shows us that Mandatory alcohol screening is specific to alcohol. They're looking just for alcohol. They come across suspended drivers who shouldn't be driving, but it didn't go up. It's the same as it was before. So we're getting a specific effect here of the mandatory alcohol screening. If you look at the data on the number of arrests, number of incidents, as Statistics Canada refers to them, over the last several years, you'll see that in 2019, the number of incidents actually increased a little bit from 2018. And you'd expect that to some extent because we're checking more drivers. You'd expect the number of arrests to go up. And the Edmonton data show that as well. But thereafter, the numbers are going down. That's what you'd expect to see. It's going to take some time to get those numbers down because general deterrence takes time to take effect. But we're seeing a hint here that it's actually happening. We didn't have fatality data to look at for the whole country a few years ago, but so we thought, well, let's see what we can get. We talked to 5 provinces. They provided us with data on driver fatalities, and we simply separated them into whether they were not impaired or they were impaired. And if you look at the percent change from the pre-mass period to the post-mass period, which was only 1 year, you see that non-impaired driver fatalities went down 6.1%. So there's an overall reduction in driver fatalities over that period of time. But in impaired driver fatalities, they went down 39%. That's a huge difference. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that that is going to stay that way. And these are preliminary data, but it gives us a sense that something was working. And it occurred right about the time that mandatory alcohol screening was introduced. So, final word, mandatory alcohol screening enhances the effectiveness and enforcement. We're better able to detect drivers who have been drinking. There's no missing them. If you're tested and you're positive, we're going to know it. It means that drinking drivers are less likely to avoid detection than they were before. In fact, if you're screened, you can't avoid it. We've got a breath test on you. We know if you've been drinking. You can't fake it. You can't try and act sober. It's not going to matter. So in general, mandatory alcohol screening creates this general deterrence. It provides an enhanced perception of being caught. We have the Australian studies that show that, and the initial indications that we have with the limited data we have shows positive results. We do, however, need to continue to study this. Ongoing evaluations need to guide us going forward and see how we can improve this. How do we just need to do more of it? Is there something else we can do? And to document its benefits in reducing impaired driving. And that's all I have to say.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Doug and Joanna. Excellent presentations, great overview. Wow, just a lot of information. And yeah, it's obviously having quite an impact from the study that you showed in Edmonton, but also the fatality data and the decrease of 39%. Like, wow, that's incredible. So we'll turn now to our questions, and we do have some that are coming in. So I'll just start with the first one. How discretionary is mandatory alcohol screening? The screening is not always conducted during a traffic stop. Do we still rely on the traditional indicators of odor, slurred speech, eyes to determine whether or not to do mandatory alcohol screening? And I don't, either one.
I'll try that one. So how discretionary is, so that, I mean, like any police power, it's in the criminal code, and the police can use it. So there is no requirement that police use mandatory alcohol screening. They may choose to rely on the suspicion-based power that still exists. So the mandatory comes from when the police officer makes the demand, it is mandatory for the driver to comply. So that's what the mandatory refers to in this realm. And we do know, and this is something that I think is being worked on, some police forces embraced mandatory alcohol screening right out of the gate. And that's where the data that Doug was talking about came from, Alberta, Edmonton in particular. They were in for a penny, in for a pound. They went all over it and they got great data. Other police forces have been less enthusiastic, but there was something in the media last week that Saskatchewan has recently, their RCMP in Saskatchewan have recently directed all of their officers in a traffic stop to just ask everyone. You don't need suspicion. You don't need those indicators. If you're driving and a police officer asks you to blow, that's it. So that's, I hope that helps answer that question.
Okay, great. Thanks. Doug, did you have anything else to add, or?
Well, Joanna alluded to this earlier. When you talk to police officers who do mandatory alcohol screening, the one thing that they will tell you is they find people who are drinking who they would never have expected to be positive for alcohol, which just goes to show you that people can hide it to some degree, or you're not looking for the right things or whatever. But mandatory alcohol screening, doesn't eliminate the use of those other indicators, but it adds to them. And it gives you that definitive outcome. Yes, they're drinking, there's alcohol in the person's system, or there isn't. It's as simple as that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And I guess in terms of training the officers, I mean, they need to kind of know the research that relying on smell and other things isn't always reliable, and you just need to, like what you said, Joanna, in Saskatchewan, that everybody should do it. So that really needs to be communicated, I would think. Okay, so the next question, this is for Joanna. What would it take for mandatory alcohol screening to be expanded to other modes of transportation? I work in the rail sector, and we have post-incident impairment data that could be used to support expanding screening.
That's a really good question. It's not something that has come up for us before. There hasn't been significant pressure on the government that I'm aware of to expand mandatory alcohol screening. That data would be very important, I think. Like, if the change would need to be supported by evidence that it's necessary. And I think there likely will be, but I can't say for sure, an interest in making sure that jurisprudence, the constitutional challenges around mandatory alcohol screening on the road is well settled before the power is expanded further. But as a first step, we'd love to see that data.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Can I just add in here?
Yeah, of course.
And I'm going to ask just to Joanna. I was at a conference not too long ago, and somebody asked if all-terrain vehicles and snowmobiles were captured in mandatory alcohol screening. The answer we got from the police officer was, "We don't know."
They're motor vehicles. So
Okay.
if you're operating a motor vehicle and you're stopped, they can, I believe the interpretation would support a mandatory alcohol screen.
Okay, good.
Okay, perfect. I've got another question here. So it's not necessarily a question, but what I find with mass as opposed to suspicion-based testing is the preliminary screening questions, recent alcohol consumption, for instance, are not asked, which creates reliability issues regarding mouth alcohol affecting the ASD test.
So that's an interesting question that hasn't been litigated, Doug. I don't know if you know more of where this has come up. That was not, hasn't been a problem for us so far in the ongoing litigation. There are other checks and balances in the breath testing process that can guard against that. In particular, nobody is convicted for failing a roadside screening test. The 15 minutes of mouth alcohol is then considered at the evidentiary breath testing stage, and so there's no risk of conviction. The only risk might be an evidentiary test that might have been unnecessary in the interest of road safety. So I think that would be my answer to that. Yes, it does eliminate those need for those preliminary questions, but in a way that's also less invasive of people's privacy because they don't need to answer any questions. You're driving, you're exercising your privilege. Blow. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Okay, perfect. Does anything to add or?
No, that made me think of something that I forgot to mention when Edmonton did their road checks. One of the things they did was they timed the officer from the stop of the vehicle to when they were released, if they were alcohol negative. 90 seconds. It takes 90 seconds to do that. And you think, well, 90 seconds is long. No, it's not. If you live in the city and in a suburb and you have to get on a main road to go somewhere, you have a stoplight. I timed the stoplights. There's 2 stoplights, depending on which way I go to leave my house. One of them, the stoplight to turn from the end of the green to the start of the next green, it's over 2 minutes. Who am I to complain to about that? 90 seconds for a breath test to save lives? I do it in a second. It's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, great. We've got another question here. Do any jurisdictions allow mandatory testing after a crash, for example? So if police do not pull someone over, but come upon a scene where someone is injured or killed?
It's an interesting question. I saw it come up, and hi, Steve. I see who the questioner is, and I know it's an issue that we know is out there because the operational limitations on mandatory alcohol screening are that you must be operating. In Canada, it currently doesn't apply in situations after an accident if the driver has exited the vehicle. Arguments could be made that mandatory alcohol screening could be expanded to include that. The specific question on the international, I've never done that research. Probably should put it on my list of things to do. Doug, I don't know if you know.
No, I don't. I don't know that answer to that question.
Okay. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. You had mentioned, Joanna, the study that was done in 2009, which highlighted the effectiveness of the mandatory alcohol screening. And yet it was 2018 when it was enacted here in Ontario. And I'm just curious why there was that big delay. And was it the fact of cannabis legalization that kind of, got people looking at all this evidence? And yeah, anyway.
I mean, I think I can sort of answer a bit glibly out of the gate saying the wheels of justice move slowly, and Ottawa is no exception. I think these things just take time, and I know 10 years seems like an eternity for people who are looking for change, but in the legislative space, it's not unheard of that things can take that long or longer to go from good idea to legislative reality. So, but your instincts, Brenda, are correct. I think cannabis legalization certainly provided an opportunity for the government to look at the issue of impaired driving more broadly and address both drug impaired driving and alcohol impaired driving at the same time.
Okay, great, thanks. And you've both alluded to how out west, you mentioned Alberta, particularly Edmonton, have really taken it up, and how other provinces have been more hesitant. And I just wondered if both of you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and just what are some of the barriers that are preventing it from getting expanded as much as we would like to see.
So I can speak to the power itself is national. It's in the criminal law. And so it applies. It is any officer in Canada who conducts a lawful traffic stop can use a mandatory alcohol screening power. So it's up to individual police agencies, the amount of resources they want to invest in traffic enforcement. If they're comfortable with the power, I think my initial sense is there was some early hesitancy around the constitutionality, and so nobody wanted to be the first one to be the officer testifying in court as to why they did it. I think with any new power, there's growing pains. Our role in the sort of in this space is to create the power, and we monitor it. And there's others out there, I think, and I think it's catching on, given that Saskatchewan has just sort of made this announcement. So hoping to see that more. And I know Steve is on the call. MAD has recently done a survey, sort of, I think, asking police officers what the reluctance was. So I know he's not a panelist, but I know people are looking at this question as well.
Great, thanks. Doug, did you have anything to add?
Well, I agree with what Joanna said. And the officers I've talked to, it has a lot to do with more the senior police officers in terms of what they're directing their officers to do. And some are saying every traffic stop, do a breath test. And others are saying, yeah, it takes a long time if you catch one, and that takes you off the road. And, there are priorities. Impaired driving isn't the only priority that police have. So you really have to, balance things out a little bit. And it depends on whether or not you believe in it working or not too, I think. So we've got a ways to go before it becomes universal across the country and being done to the same extent.
Okay, great. And actually, Steve Sullivan from MAD, sorry to put you on the spot, but just if you're comfortable sharing about what I've just asked.
Sure, and I'm glad you can't see me because I'm wearing an old hoodie, so that's a good thing. Yeah, Joanna's right. We did do a survey or a scan of police services across the country in terms of Bill C-46, so the mandatory alcohol screening, the drug impaired stuff. Our timing wasn't the greatest because it was not that long after the pandemic, which I think had a real impact on the rollout of MAS and other of the tools. But it seemed to be more, I think, as Doug mentioned, if the senior leadership had a plan, had encouraged it, then officers were using it. But I think we found too, as I think Doug mentioned too, there is a growing comfortableness with it. And I don't know there's any evidence to this, but in talking to police officers from provinces where they have immediate roadside prohibition programs, it seems to be used more, because I know when you're doing criminal charges, it's a lot of police time, a lot of police resources, but when you're doing IRPs, it's a relatively quick process, so police can process those cases fairly quickly. So I'm wondering if there's a bit of a connection there as well. But thanks for the chance to chat.
Sorry, thanks so much, Steve. I appreciate you doing this on the spot. And actually, that does bring us to the end of our webinar time. So I would like to thank Joanna and Doug and Steve for chiming in there at the end. And a very interesting topic, and maybe we can get you back in a couple of years to give us an update, or even sooner if things are progressing faster, because I think we're all anxious to see how this rolls out. So, but it's very encouraging to hear what the impact of it is, and it's great. And thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.